So as of this morning or last night or what have you, the horrific bombing of Gaza has restarted. This is a campaign that I believe counts as ethnic cleansing. It has wiped out upwards of 15,000 Palestinians, possibly many, many more than that. What's so disturbing is that this is coming at the end of a ceasefire that was making progress towards the return of hostages. Supposedly, we're told over and over again that the main concern is to bring the hostages back, well, not murdering thousands of people every day or hundreds of people every day. Was making progress towards hostages going back and forth, and I think most agree that Hamas was amenable to continuing that process. Regardless, the Israeli government has restarted this horrific campaign. Over the past 2 months, U.S. taxpayer dollars, my taxpayer dollars, U.S. bombs, have slaughtered 5,000 to 10,000 completely innocent Palestinian children, and that's starting again this morning. We should never diminish in any way the horrors that were committed on October 7th against Israel by this gross little government that Netanyahu supported, this Hamas government that Netanyahu supported for decades. We should not in any way minimize the horrific crimes that were committed on October 7th, but that does not mean we should forget the crimes that are being committed against Palestinian children on October 8th, on October 9th, on October 10th, throughout the rest of October, throughout the rest of November, and now starting up again in December. We have to stop this for basic humanity. And I think that we should be aware that there's a fire hose of propaganda and distraction being sent at us to minimize the actual murders that we are committing, and we should stop committing those murders. So instead of continuing negotiations that we're working to bring the hostages back, we've decided to go back to all-out war and U.S. bombs blowing up Palestinian children. I'm at a bit of a loss this morning, because there's really nothing else that I can do. I thought I'd just pick apart one particular part of sort of Instagram propaganda that came across the transom. I was actually sent this morning. So in some ways directly as a justification of what the Israeli government has chosen to do over the past 24 hours. This is being used as a justification for what Israel is doing right now. So what we're doing here is we are diving into history a little bit, the larger history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And actually, it's key here to point out this is the first bit of the dodge that we're talking about here. This isn't Israeli-Palestinian history, this is Israeli-Arab history. There's a lot of Israeli information stuff out there that I think quite validly points out that, in fact, the Arab countries around Israel in the Middle East and North Africa more broadly have actually really abandoned the Palestinians and the Gazans in particular over this 80-year period. So that's just the first thing to point out, that we're now blaming Arab countries, or rather we're blaming Palestinians and Gazans for what a bunch of Arab countries did, when we acknowledge generally, everybody who talks about this, that actually the Arab countries have totally abandoned the Palestinians and the Gazans. That's sort of a first level to talk about here. This graphic here is persuasive to a lot of normies, folks who don't pay attention to how this conflict has evolved historically. And I can see why. I mean, there are Arabs in Israel. There are very much fewer Jewish Middle Easterners in all of these Middle Eastern countries. There's a lot of in-depth historical reasons why I don't find this particularly persuasive as somebody who has followed this conflict in some depth for some years. I'd say just briefly, what's interesting about this, the 1948 number here and how much higher the Jewish populations of all of these Middle Eastern countries were in 1948 kind of destroys a whole other range of historical Israeli partisanship. In 1948, when Israel was founded, when the Israelis decided to do something vastly differently, there were plenty of Jews living throughout the Middle East. This is the launching part. I think it is entirely fair to point out that no, actually, this was not something that the Israelis did. This is something that the Germans did that ended up doing this. It is not something that the Arabs did. In the context of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, it was the Israelis that started it. And it is 1948 that launched the horrific series of reciprocal ethnic cleansings that happened. On the topic of those reciprocal ethnic cleansings, these are not the same. Israel worked very, 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 very hard to get all those Middle Eastern populations to move to Israel in the years after 1948. There absolutely were push factors. There absolutely was systematic discrimination against Jewish populations in these countries. There absolutely were, I'm sure there were even a few horrific massacres, though honestly, I think I'd know more about them if there were more of them. But there was certainly systematic discrimination, systematic awfulness by the Middle Eastern governments to their Jewish populations, 100%. But also the Israeli government was doing everything it could to carry out that ethnic cleansing. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to talk about, to clarify, the Israeli government was doing everything it could to force Jews out of the Middle East and to Israel. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to complain about that very successful result from their perspective. But those are sort of broader historical issues that, I don't particularly feel like getting into in great detail today. I do think it's worth talking about this in an even broader historical perspective. As somebody who has spent a lot of time looking at ongoing atrocities everywhere over the past decade or so, and has spent a lot of time reading the deep history of genocide, man's cruelty to man, or what have you. Let's just take this, leaving aside the quibbles I made earlier, let's just take this on its merits. Let's say, okay, over the past 80 years, Muslims have done worse things to Jews than Jews have done to Muslims. I don't believe that on any level, but let's just go with that. Let's assume that. What this brings to mind for me is the Turkish government, if you want to call it the Ottoman Empire or what have you, Turks, in 1915. In 1915, the Turks could put together a set of figures across the Balkans and parts of the Russian Empire, and put together a graphic much like this, talking about the horrific ethnic cleansing of Muslims out of places like Greece, like Circassia, like Crimea, that they absolutely could have put something together that is this persuasive. That would in no way justify the Armenian genocide that they carried out in 1915. And I think that's the key thing here about so much of the information we've been flooded with on Instagram and elsewhere. At the point of, let's relitigate this entire 80-year history in the hopes that you won't look at what we're doing today. You won't look at the tens of thousands of people that have been murdered. Easily, this isn't certain, but easily could be up to 10,000 completely innocent children that have been massacred. The population of 2 million that has now been rendered homeless. Don't look at what's happening there. Let's litigate what's been going on for the past 80 years. And I think it's important to recognize that fundamentally stuff like this, or complaining about slogans that might be being used on college campuses, this is all a dodge to avoid the very real slaughter that is happening right now. Another detail that I think is worth mentioning is, as someone who has been a student of the history of the Ottoman Empire and the founding sort of massacres that led from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, it's worth pointing out that in the city of Istanbul, during the heights of Armenian massacres in 1915, Greek massacres in 1922, there were always Armenians and Greeks living in Istanbul. Now, those populations were persecuted in different ways later on in times, but during the heights of the most horrific things that could possibly be blamed on the Turks, in 1915 and 1922, there were Armenians and Greeks in the capital of Turkey going about their daily lives as more or less protected members of the citizenry. And that's how I think about Israeli Arabs. We hear a lot about, yes, the truth that there are millions of Israeli citizens that are of Arab descent, and that is to Israel's credit. I think you can make arguments that population has found itself in more danger in recent years, but that's great. But that does not make up for what is being done to the Gazans. It does not make up for what is being done in the West Bank. And there are horrible things being done in the West Bank where Hamas has no governing presence. And I think that it's that sort of dodge that we should be aware of here. We should not be talking about the 80 years of Arab-Israeli history here. We should not be talking about what Morocco or Algeria might have done to their Jewish populations, when we should be talking about U.S. taxpayer-funded bombs that are exploding the bodies of Palestinian children right now. We should not be litigating the question of Israeli Arab citizenship when we have schools and hospitals in Gaza exploding right now. I'm happy to litigate the deep history of these things, as I think I've made clear in this video, but the slaughter that is occurring right now is what we should be focusing on, and stopping that slaughter right now is what we should be focusing on. And then, yeah, let's discuss at length the validity and seriousness of historical claims. It feels honestly kind of pointless to be discussing this sort of thing when bombs are exploding in Gaza right now. Bombs that I paid for. Bombs that have been demonstrated to be pointless by the past more or less week of ceasefire that yielded dramatically more live Israeli hostages returned to their families. That's something that's happening right now. I guess that's all I got this morning. Thanks.